This episode is brought to you by my 10-week Fertility Awareness Mastery Group program. If you're listening in real time, registration for my January 2018 groups is now open. To reserve your spot today, make sure to head over to fertilityfriday.com/group program. That's fertilityfriday.com/group program. This is the Fertility Friday podcast, episode number 171. Welcome to the 171st episode of the Fertility Friday podcast. Thank you for joining me today. I'm Lisa from fertilityfriday.com, and this is your source for information about the fertility awareness method and all things fertility. I'm excited to bring you another installment of my Fertility Awareness Reality Series today. In today's episode, I'm interviewing Madi, and she is a member of my most recent Fertility Awareness Mastery Group program. And so Madi was in my birth control group, and we had such a great conversation today. What I love about Madi is that, she really took the opportunity of the group to ask a lot of really great questions. So today's episode is just a great example of all the different questions that come up in the group. And ultimately, it's a reflection of what I'm trying to create, which is literally a safe space where you can ask all of those questions. Where else can you ask questions about your cervical mucus, from how much it stretches to the color and how many times you see it and how to wipe it, and even the awkward questions about how do I wipe after I have a number 2, or how does this whole thing work with the wiping and the fluids. And so it's always TMI whatever day it is. So for on Tuesday, it's always TMI Tuesday in our groups, because ultimately the goal of the group is to create a safe space to talk about all of these issues, a place where you can get all of your questions answered, where no question is too silly. Because honestly, I've been doing this for so long that I don't think that anyone can surprise me anymore. I've heard like every question. So ultimately, it's this amazing safe space where you can really get your questions answered and not feel any kind of way about asking any kind of question that you can think of that's related to checking your cervical mucus, cervical position, even questions around sex and pain with sex, or whatever the case is. It's a lot of intimate details. It's the nature of this work. It's the nature of fertility awareness. We're talking about a lot of intimate details, and we're also talking about a lot of bodily fluids. So I really hope you enjoyed today's episode with Madi. And, if you're also inspired to really jump in and learn fertility awareness, really gain that confidence, I want to invite you to join my 10-week Fertility Awareness Mastery Group program. So this is a program that I only run a couple of times a year. And so, our next group is starting in January. We are going to start 2018 strong. And so we are going to actually have our first meetings within the first couple of weeks of the year. So I would really encourage you to head over to fertilityfriday.com/group program. If you're wanting to jump in and join us, make sure to apply sooner than later. There's only a limited number of women that I can have in a group, to make sure that each woman in the group has time, so that I have time to really go through each woman's charts, so that in our sessions, we take turns and we do what I call a rotating hot seat. So everyone gets an opportunity to not only have a session with me, but also to have individual sessions within the group setting, which really allows for all of the members to get to know each other and to learn and benefit from seeing other women's charts, and to really learn from the struggles that other women are dealing with. So make sure to join us if you're wanting to be part of the group. Spaces are limited, so head over to fertilityfriday.com/group program for more information. And with that, let's jump into today's episode. And so today I'm very excited to welcome my guest, Madi, to the show. Madi is a current member of my most recent 10-week Fertility Awareness Mastery Group program. And so since we're coming towards the end of our time together, we have been hanging out for quite some time. So we know each other quite well now. We've had lots of fun in the group, and I'm really excited to have her on the show. So without further ado, welcome to the show, Madi.
Thank you. I'm really happy to be here.
Well, I'm super excited. I sent out an email, and as you can imagine, I got like so many responses. I always say this. I think I say this probably for every Fertility Awareness Reality Series episode, but it takes a lot of courage to come on the show and to share personal details about your life. And I know that for most of the women who do it, it's just because, either the podcast has touched them and they want to be part of it. But I just want to thank you for being here, because I know that these episodes really do help and support a lot of women. And there's a lot of women listening. So
Yay! I've been avidly listening to the podcast, so I was just hoping that I would get a chance to be on here.
I love it. Well, I'm
Yeah,
really glad to have you. Well, and so I really like to start just to give listeners a little bit of background. So, I mean, I know a lot about your situation and what's going on, but maybe for the listeners, you could take us back to when your period first started and, if you have a history of hormonal birth control use and basically what has led you to where we are now.
sure. So I think I started my period around age 13. I was near the end of seventh grade. And I had my period pretty regularly, like not infrequently. I remember it being a little bit heavy, but not alarmingly so. I started hormonal contraceptives around the age of 19 and have been off and on hormonal contraceptives from about 19 to 26, roughly. Briefly used a pill once or twice, but primarily used the NuvaRing. And then there were a few occasions where I used Plan B. And then after around 26, there was, I don't know, a brief, like a period of a year or so where I wasn't on hormonal contraceptives. And then I decided to get the Paragard, and I took the pill for about a month before putting the Paragard in at the recommendation of a physician. And then I had the Paragard for I think around 18 or 20 months. And then I've had the Paragard out for almost a year. So that's where I'm at now.
Well, and with the Paragard, so the copper IUD, my understanding is that it can be in for quite some time. So did you choose to come off of it so soon or have it removed so soon because you were reacting negatively to it, or was there another reason why you decided to?
Great question. There was multiple reasons. The Paragard I think can be left in for like 7 to 10 years, which was part of the reason I chose it. Because I wasn't sure exactly when I would decide to have children, and I didn't want to have to like take something out and put something new in for like a year. I also chose it because it didn't include hormones, and that was kind of something I was moving towards at that time. I have a history of idiopathic hypersomnia, and the only way to treat that is with amphetamines. And I, a while ago, decided to remove medications. So anyhow, the Paragard was in line with this kind of ideological shift that I was having towards not putting things in my body if I could avoid it. So anyhow, the Paragard, for the first 8 months, I had really intense cramps. I remember sitting at the dinner table and just sometimes kind of tearing up because I felt like if it was that painful, it meant something bad was happening in my body. Yeah. And I don't want to discourage people from using the Paragard because I would say that after 8 months, it did taper off and it was fine. But for me, I just had this kind of lingering kind of fear or uncertainty. And around that time, my friend was visiting from out of town, and she had taken charge of your fertility, and she was, starting on her journey towards wanting to have kids. And so she introduced the fertility awareness method to me, and I sat with that for many months before I decided to remove the Paragard and go that direction. So it was a combination of feeling like if my body was that upset that it wasn't right for me, and then also really wanting to try trusting my body and my own ability to prevent pregnancy.
Well, and I've talked about this on the show quite a bit, but the shift between, using some sort of artificial birth control to actually using fertility awareness. So you're part of the birth control group, so not actively trying, actively avoiding. So for you, what helped you, or what was it that helped you actually get to that point of readiness where you were willing to make that leap?
So, I mean, I will not claim to have read all of the pages of Taking Charge of Your Fertility. It is a big book.
Huge.
I would like to get through it at some point, but I'm not quite there. But I think what really hit home was reading the actual science behind it, and I think one of the big takeaways that I, from experience talking to other women, kind of come away with is that idea that, or that myth buster that you're not able to conceive every day of your cycle, because we all grow up thinking that that's true, and it's not. So I think the scientific basis of it was really reassuring. I also had a close friend who started using it very successfully. So I think those are the two main reasons. But it is hard, when you talk to physicians about it, there's definitely mixed responses. People confuse it with the rhythm method.
Yeah.
still.
It's interesting because there is so much science behind it, and since kind of the early 30s, which is very interesting.
Yeah.
So it's
so hidden.
Yeah, it's so hidden, and obviously that's one of the reasons why this is so wonderful to be able to bring this out to light. I think in your case as well, you mentioned that one of your really close friends is using it successfully, and that makes a huge difference, because then you're not just alone, like you're not just the lone weirdo doing this weird thing that no one knows about. It's really helpful to have that exposure. And so I just want to ask you then a little bit about where the rubber hits the road, so to speak, because I know for me personally, 15 years ago, and also we talked about this a little bit in the group, and this always comes up, especially for clients who are using birth control, the method for birth control, but there's still a difference. So even though you know the science and you know how it works, and even when you start charting and you see it, so you physically see your mucus and then you see your temperature shift and you know what's happening logically, it's still a bit of a jump to actually like have the unprotected sex on the infertile days. So for you, what was that transition like, more specifically when you actually started adopting the method?
I think for a long time, I started charting before I had the IUD out, like mostly just temperatures. And then for many months, there was a lot of very confused charting because I wasn't really sure what I was seeing. My temps were all over the place. And I found that the categories of like dry, sticky, wet were a little too narrow. I was using the Kindara app. So for a long time, I couldn't make sense of the charts I was seeing. I couldn't see a clear like pre-ovulatory and ovulatory shift. So I would say in the last few months, though, I have been seeing a temperature shift. So having unprotected sex in the post-ovulatory phase has been not too hard for me at that point, because I'm like, okay, I know I'm not fertile. It's pretty clear. Pre-ovulatory is a bit more difficult, especially since my temps are still a little bit all over the place, and I don't always see the clearest, most clean cervical fluid shift either. So I kind of steer clear of that. The temp shift is kind of like the one golden thing where I'm like, okay, I'm good. No matter what else happens after that, if I wait, I should be fine. But pre-ovulatory is still kind of a risky zone, I feel.
Yeah.
Which is unfortunate, because I usually have a pretty significant chunk of my cycle is pre-ovulatory right now. So I don't feel like I have a ton of days that I'm confident are saying are infertile. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I believe that will change with time, but we're not quite there yet.
Well, and I really appreciate you sharing that. And of course, you can get a sense of why I'm asking that, because I think it's helpful to paint a picture of what it can really look like. I think that, well, this is something that we spoke about at length in the group, but the normal progression that any woman who transitions to the fertility awareness method goes through. And so after you've been charting for a little while, you do start to see that pattern, and it's very reassuring to see the temperature shift every time you ovulate, and then the changes that happen to your mucus every time. And so the more that you see that, the more that it is real, and the more that you can trust it. And so naturally, the first stage after you've gotten comfortable with the whole charting thing is to move into the post-ovulatory phase. And then the pre-ovulatory phase, what I always say is that when your cycles are healthy, and so not that your cycles are unhealthy, but they're typical from kind of transitioning. So you had several years of hormonal birth control use, using different methods, using the copper IUD. And so in some ways, your cycle is still in like a transitional period. That's a harder period to chart in, because often you just have more days of mucus. Mm-hmm. So what it comes down to is that for a woman that isn't in that transition phase, whose cycles have leveled off, whether she didn't have a history of hormonal birth control use, or she's been off of it long enough that her cycles are settled down and sorted out any fallout that happened around that, she'll typically have fewer days of mucus. So she'll just have a clear, like, dry, mucus, dry. So it's more challenging in the pre-ovulatory window, especially when you have more mucus. So I really appreciate you taking us through that, Madi. Let's jump in. So we have had our private consultation together. We've had a number of hot seat sessions in the group. And so we're kind of up on what's happening in your charts. But there's a few things that you brought up also that you wanted to talk about. So maybe we could start with some of the charting. I know you had a couple of mucus related questions and things like that. And I'm just going to take a peek at your check-in form to see. So I suppose that would be a good place to start.
Yeah. Okay. So on the day-to-day, and I feel like one of my charting struggles is less so with the charting and more so with logistics. I'm, like the mobile app for Kindara is really easy, but it doesn't have all the options. And then I struggle sometimes to get all the data into the computer each day. So I'm still trying to find out a good work around that, because I hate going back and trying to put it all in and relook at my notes that I've made for myself.
Well, and for the listeners, I teach the Justisse method, and so with that method, there's different observations, more detail in what you're putting down, and so that figuring out how to do that. I don't know if this is helpful to you, Madi, but I have worked with some clients who have, how you can add in as many additional categories as you want on your Kindara chart.
Oh, yeah, you can.
So I've had clients who will add in things. So they'll add in the different sensations, or they'll add in the different... It really depends on the personality of the person, because, for some women, having like 20 deep of individual notations is helpful, and for others it might not be. But that's something that you could play with to see if that would make it easier.
Yeah, that's a great idea. I think I'll try maybe that and paper charting and see what sticks. But yeah, that's just a side note. That's been a struggle for me lately. But we were talking about mucus. That's right. So, well, first I had just a really nitty gritty logistical question. And these are the kinds of things that occurred to me, and then I forget, and I know that they're super, super granular, and there's gotta be some woman out there with a similar question. But so I know in the Justisse guide, when they are showing a diagram for wiping, and they'll display like the vulva and a woman wiping across the vulva to the perineum. And I find that sometimes I'll get a dry sensation when wiping, because the actual labia are right there, and they're kind of covering the opening. Mm-hmm. And so my really nitty-gritty question for you is the proper form then to part the labia in order to wipe more directly?
I'm really glad you asked that question because I just want to clarify the sensation piece of it. So actually, when you're wiping, the sensation specifically is the feeling you get when the tissue crosses over your perineum. Mm-hmm. So although the tissue will also cross over the labia and the vaginal opening, it's actually between the vaginal opening and the anus that we're paying attention to the sensation. So I don't know if that helps, but specifically you want to pay attention to the sensation you feel as the tissue crosses your perineum. Okay. So is that what you've been doing, or have you been trying to pay attention to the sensation on your labia?
I don't think I've necessarily, probably a little bit of both. I logistically definitely know that it's supposed to be the perineum, but I have a feeling that when I'm wiping, I'm probably paying closer attention to what I'm feeling across the labia. But I guess my question is, because when we're wiping, we're in theory wiping cervical fluid from the vaginal opening across the perineum. But if the labia are kind of protecting that or closing over it, different women have different labia, I guess is my point. So that in that diagram, they're very parted on their own, I guess is the nitty gritty of my question.
Yeah. So for the listeners that don't get to see the lovely picture of the vulva that I'm holding up right now, that's a really good question. Part of the observational routine is that you're checking so frequently throughout the day that if there was something there, it does have to come out. So I would say that just depending on, I would say that's something you could experiment with. So you could see if it makes a difference if you part them a little bit versus if you just wipe, because that's one of those individual things that the kind of standard wiping technique wouldn't account for. But ultimately, I would say what I always say about that, which is that, well, if there's something in there, it has to come out. Gravity pulls it down. And so curious, though, when I take a look at your chart, I do see that you are able to see mucus. So are you concerned that you're not seeing it, or are you concerned that maybe there's some that you're not seeing?
I don't really think I'm super concerned that I'm not seeing it, because literally if there's anything shiny or whatever on the toilet paper, I try and pick it up. And a lot of times I pick up stuff that I'm not sure anybody else could pick up. I really get down, sometimes it's it'll stretch, but I can only get it to stretch once, or so I'm not worried so much that I'm missing it. I was just curious more in terms of like, what's proper form?
Right. Yeah. Well, yeah, good question. I would say generally it wouldn't make that big of a difference, but
Okay.
certainly on an individual basis, you could see. I'd be interested to see if it made a difference.
Yeah. I'll have to try it out. Beyond that, I think, as I was looking at the pictures in the book, I feel like maybe I discovered like my own gap in my understanding. So I was looking at the pictures, like, for example, damp with lubrication. Mm-hmm. And I'm assuming that on that picture, it just looks like a tissue with a wet spot. But I'm assuming that the reason they've said it's a 10 DL is because they can pick something up, right?
Actually, no. So this gets into,
no?
I'm going to pull up something to show you because I like to teach with visuals. At some point, I'll have the podcast visual. I have not embraced that yet.
Is that a thing? I didn't know that was a thing.
Well, you could just do it on YouTube.
Oh, it's just a video. Yep. I got so excited about new technology.
But I should say that there are video podcasts on iTunes. So there's audio and video. So cool. Next time you sign in, you'll be like, whoa. All right, but I'm going to pull up this chart. So basically what we're talking about here is the nitty gritty of the charting. And so this is a lot of detailed information that it just doesn't always make sense to go through in a podcast. But essentially the charting system that Justisse uses is based on the charting system through Cretan. And so Dr. Thomas Hilgers created what he called the vaginal discharge recording system, if I'm saying that correctly. And it's essentially like a standardized way of noting mucus. I always joke, and it's not really a joke, that everything that comes out of your vagina comes on this chart. And so there's different categories. We look at not only if you have mucus or not, but if it stretches, how much does it stretch and how many times a day do you see it? And so that's what we're referring to here, just so that if you're kind of like, what the heck are they talking about? So basically what it comes down to it is that Madi's question is about peak mucus. And so we make that distinction between peak and non-peak, peak being clear or stretchy or lubricative, and then non-peak being everything else. So if you've read Taking Charge of Your Fertility, sticky, creamy egg white is the extent of the description. And so technically non-peak would be mucus that falls into that category of sticky and creamy most of the time. And then peak would fall into the category of egg white. So Madi, your question is, if you wipe, across the vulva, as we were talking about, across the perineum, and you have a sensation what is this damp with lubrication sensation?
Right. And I think it's if you feel lubrication, but there's nothing that's finger testable, is that, yay.
That's it. And so it's like the two categories of peak. So with peak mucus, there's one peak mucus that you can actually pick up and test between your fingers. So you can pick it up and stretch it as if it was raw egg white, and it's giving you that little string between your fingers as you pull. And then there's a lubricative sensation by itself. So you wipe and it feels super slippery, but then there's nothing you can literally finger test. So both signs are equally fertile. And so this goes back to like the detail we talked about with mucus, with the different types of mucus, and your cervical crypts produce different types of mucus, and that mucus has different qualities. So you can essentially, that's just one of the qualities of peak, which is super slippery. And it probably means that your mucus is such a high water content. It's probably up there like 98, 99% water. And so there's just not enough substance to pick it up, but it still gives you that lubricative sensation when you wipe.
Okay. Another question I had, and it's kind of on that same page of the Justisse guide, but for example, it's the picture of like sticky cloudy and sticky clear. So I have, several like 6s on my chart, but I gotta say, they do not look like those pictures. And I don't want to, stress over that too much, but I was marking that for days when I had that kind of like semi-dried rubber cement type mucus that I've talked about before, because it stretches a little bit. And if I like really work it, sometimes it'll stretch more, but it's not really, I can pick it up, but it's not super stretchy.
So one thing to keep in mind is the pictures, from my understanding, the pictures in the book are not actual mucus.
Okay.
So
I'll
kind
keep
of,
that in mind.
yeah. So kind of like when I in class use lotion and different things to simulate mucus, it's the same idea. So although we're getting very close in, it helps for the purpose of explaining, there are subtle differences. So what I would focus on is just the basics. It's like when you wipe, what color is it? How much does it stretch? And in terms of putting it on there, if it doesn't look exactly like the diagram, that's okay. So in this picture, I'm just going to flip the screen. So basically what we're looking at is mucus that doesn't stretch very much at all. So mucus that like when you pick it up and put it between your fingers, it doesn't stretch beyond 1/4 of an inch. And so it's possible to have peak mucus that is, so it's clear, but it just doesn't stretch that much. And then it's possible to have creamy white colored mucus that doesn't stretch very much as well. So obviously, Madi, I'm saying this for the benefit of the listener because I know you know this.
Yeah, for sure.
So please bear with me. That's what I would say there. I mean, what can be helpful to keep in mind? So when we had our session, so the first, I would say 3 or 4 were probably more specific to mucus. And so if you think about what's happening towards the beginning of your fertile window, so I'll just flip back to your chart. After your period, what happens is you have a very low level of progesterone and also a very low level of estrogen. And so what that means is that the low level of progesterone that you have is stimulating your cervix to produce that G-type mucus, which is basically a thick mucus plug. And on those days are your dry days. So if I look at this cycle here, after your period, you had dry days for the first 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 days afterwards. And so what happens at the beginning of your fertile window when you first start going into it is that as your estrogen levels are rising in your cycle, your cervix is responding to that, and the estrogen stimulates different crypts to start producing your estrogenic mucus. So that's the mucus that we actually see. And so for some women, so not all women experience this the same way, but some women will experience what looks like that kind of sticky type mucus. And that's a result of your estrogenic mucus combining and dissolving and breaking down that plug, the mucus plug, and then basically giving you that observation. Is that helpful?
Yeah, that's helpful.
And then for other women, I'll just put it out there that not all women see non-peak and not all women see peak. So there are some women who don't necessarily have a bunch of sticky kind of quote unquote non-peak mucus days. They just go right into their peak.
I don't think that's me.
But I think it's helpful to talk about that because when you read a book about the cycle, you get the sense that every woman's cycle is supposed to look like this. When almost, I shouldn't say almost no women, but very few women's cycles look like that. I've worked with very few women whose cycles look like the charts that you'll see in Taking Charge of Your Fertility.
Yeah, that's true. That's always good to remember because I definitely am like, why doesn't my mucus look like the pictures? And, I want it to be really clear and by the book, but probably unrealistic.
Well, and what I'll say is that from my observations, what I've seen is that I've had a few clients that have what I call virgin cycles, which are you've never taken hormonal contraceptives, or a client who took contraceptives for 6 months once when they were 20 and had a really bad reaction and then have literally never taken them ever since. And so for women who have those quote unquote virgin cycles, and the caveat, they don't have any endocrine issues to speak of, they just have regular old cycles that look pretty much like the book. However, the majority of my clients have a history of hormonal contraceptive use and often come to me within that transition phase when their body's organizing that. And so I guess it's not normal, quote unquote, but it is normal in the context of that history. Well, it doesn't make it harder to chart, actually. That's not true. It makes it harder as the woman behind the chart knowing and seeing that her chart doesn't look like the image and it logistically having more potentially fertile days.
Yeah, I think it requires more patience. It would have been, awesome to learn this method before I was even sexually active, for example. Yeah. That's a whole variable just removed from the equation, but we don't teach this to good people. So.
Yet.
Yet, yes, yet. The power of yet.
Yet. So I know one of the things that we spoke a little bit about was your mucus. So I'm taking a look at your cycle here, and I'm seeing a bit of a difference. So in your previous cycle, so I'm looking at your September chart here, you had fewer days of mucus, and it looked like you ovulated earlier in the cycle. So it looked like you ovulated around day 20 in this chart.
Yeah. And I'm curious there. I mean, I guess because I see, my temperature spikes and then drops back down. It doesn't really sustain that high temperature because this is, I think, marked as like a potentially false high temperature.
That one, yeah.
So, yeah. So I'm just curious. I think in my mind, I assumed that I ovulated somewhere around here, but.
Well, and so the chart that we're looking at.
I guess, sorry, you can't see what I'm pointing at.
Well, I'm assuming that you're pointing to like
the second high temp.
Yeah.
Which is.
Yeah. So for the listeners, basically Madi had a temperature pattern where, she has the usual kind of ups and downs. And then around the exact day of kind of a peak mucus observation that looks like it would be correlated with ovulation, she has this like almost 1 full degree temperature spike, but it's also, we can't count on that observation because it was associated with another, like there was a reason to question it. However, after that day, we see that your temperatures they still remain higher. So what
That's
we're
true.
looking for, what I'm looking for when I'm trying to use the temperature, so the temperature when you're waking up in the morning to identify ovulation, as you know, Madi, is we want the 3 temperatures that are higher than the previous 6.
Okay.
And so although we wouldn't be able to confirm, so for the purpose of birth control, if you have a high temperature, but it's not a normal temperature. So you noted on here that you had you'd had a couple drinks the night before. Mm-hmm. And so for those of you who may not be aware of that association, for any woman, or for many women, I should say, who chart their cycles, there's this very clear correlation between drinking alcohol the night before and having a super high temp the next day. So even with that being said, if we ignore that temperature, we see that the following temperatures all remain higher. So they might not be at the top of the chart or anything, but to me, it's still obvious.
Higher.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I know you said it's like 3 temps have to be higher than the previous 6. It sounds like, though, it doesn't actually matter how much higher. Like they could be a couple, just slightly higher, but as long as they're higher.
Yeah. And so Some of the women listening, I mean, there's different methods that have different rules. So there's all these different methods of fertility awareness. So, however, when you're charting your cycles, the exact height of the temperature can give us additional information. We talked a lot about that in the group. But what I'm looking for in terms of just confirming the temp is that it's higher. And so you should be able to put a ruler, theoretically, because now everything's digital, but I'm older. Mm-hmm. So, and I'm so excited. I just printed myself a new charting book. And so I'm back to paper 100%. But so quite literally, you should be able to put the ruler alongside the chart. And after ovulation, your temperature should stay above the ruler. And so what I'm seeing here then on your October chart is more variability in your temperatures. So I'm seeing more highs and lows, a little bit more of a spiky pattern. It looks as though you ovulated around day 24, even with the spiky pattern.
Yeah.
If I ignore this temperature here, which I am.
Gotcha.
So was anything different for you this cycle? Anything later temp than usual this day? On Madi's chart here, what I'm seeing is there's a couple of days where the temperature is high, but you've made a note that maybe you got up a little later or whatever.
Well, this cycle, I was having a little bit of trouble with my thermometer. So I don't think it was necessarily taking inaccurate temperatures, but it wasn't syncing. I think there were some days where I took it a little bit later than usual. I was a little less rigorous about taking it at the same time. So that could be playing a role. And then in the last week or so, I know this is not ideal, but I stopped using the Wink and switched back to a glass thermometer because I was just sort of, there's problems with Wink syncing via Bluetooth right now due to an iOS update. So I just decided to go back to glass in the last week or so. So I did make that switch, which I think it's usually not ideal to do mid-cycle. But apart from that, I think I've been trying to sustain a lot of changes with vitamins and things like that, working with my naturopath. And I know sometimes that can have an impact, different vitamins that you're taking. So I'm not sure. There's not like one variable that's jumping out to me that would have caused problems.
Well, ultimately, I think that one of the first things that I'll say is that because I do this a lot, overall, I'm usually able to kind of edit the randoms. So if you were to take out your temperature on the 11th, the 16th, and the 23rd, because those are just not characteristic of your preovulatory phase. So to me, and you made notes on 2 of them that you got up later. So for you, getting up later makes a difference, but it doesn't mean you should never sleep in, because I believe sleep is important.
Totally.
It just means that when on those days you make note of it, which you did. And so the rule of thumb means that I put my thumb over it and then it's gone. And then we can look at the chart regardless of that. So if I look at it from that perspective, then on day 24, your temperature was 36.4. And then on day 25, we had an increase that was higher than the previous 6. Again, if I remove this temperature, there's no note, but you mentioned a few things that were different. Then it's still, to me, after the 24th, none of those temperatures are dipping back down to your typical pre-ovulatory range. So if I put ruler on the paper and I divided the pre and the post, I can still confirm the temperature shift. And it aligns with your mucus. So although your mucus patterns were a little bit different this cycle, so you didn't have as much in terms of quantity, as much stretchiness, we still have what looks like a temperature shift that's very much in line with your mucus.
I can see what you're saying about the temp shift. Like it's much clearer if I don't look at those pre-ovulatory high temps. Like if I ignore those, it's much more apparent.
Yeah. And Kandara, so we're not looking at the Kandara app. We're looking at the Justisse app, but the Kandara has the ability for you to eliminate those temperatures. So for you to label them as questionable, and then it becomes easier for you to make those distinctions. Of course, the caveat is that like if every temperature is questionable, then they're probably
you don't have a chart.
Yeah. So we have to
which is like something, I feel like especially, in the previous month, I feel like my partner and I end up, having a few drinks like a couple times a week. And I kind of reach this place of like, wow, that really makes it more difficult charting, right? So I don't know if anybody else experiences that, but I kind of reach this place of, it's probably, it might be helpful for me to just completely eliminate alcohol 100% for at least one full cycle to see what that looks like. It's easy, if I have several drinks, it's easy for me to tell. And I definitely mark that questionable, but I don't really know for sure what the impact of like one drink, for example, and what my cycle looks like without any alcohol whatsoever.
Well, and I firmly believe that we all have to live our lives. When it comes to temperature, it's helpful and important to know that temperature is variable. It's interesting because it's simultaneously, such a reliable way to confirm ovulation, but it's also highly reliable. And so as you saw in the group, especially looking at the different, at everyone else's charts, temperature can vary because of stress and illness. I mean, obviously if you have a fever, but even other hits to your immune system. So I've seen temperature vary because of a vaccination or because of eating specific types of foods for some, or seasonal allergies can trigger immune responses, and all of a sudden your temps are up and down. And obviously thyroid issues, potentially low iron. So there's all these different things that can affect your temperature, and then add alcohol to the mix and those types of things. I think in general for menstrual cycle health, if you are wanting to know if alcohol can have an effect, I think, it's pretty clear alcohol doesn't only affect your temperature, it can also have an impact on your chart. So totally. I support scientific experiments with the chart. And so I think when you're charting, it can be extremely helpful to, here we are coming towards the end of your cycle. So, prime time to start a fresh cycle and give it a shot to see if alcohol makes any difference. Add it back the following cycle and see what's changed. But on a day-to-day practical basis, I would say that as long as you're making a note of it on your chart, even if it does shoot up the temperature, it doesn't prevent you from being able to interpret your charts. It actually helps you to be able to interpret, because now you know exactly how alcohol affects your temperatures, at least.
That's true. I completely forgot that I had a flu shot in this chart.
Oh, did you mark where?
I think it was the 19th.
Okay. Well, in your case, it didn't make that big of a difference, which is good. Yeah.
But it didn't even occur to me that a vaccination, I mean, it makes sense that it would, but
yeah,
it didn't occur to me.
And that's the thing, it could. For one woman, it might shoot up her temperature the next day. For another woman, like in your case, didn't do a whole lot.
Yeah.
So tell me a little bit about, so I noticed after ovulation, we're seeing just a little bit of non-peak mucus, not a whole lot. So do you notice like a shift? Is it different? Because I know you're marking it gummy and cloudy.
It really didn't seem drastically different than what I was seeing before. It's that same, like, I call it the semi-dry rubber cement mucus. Mm-hmm. Like, it's just like, it's really, if I really like move it different directions between my fingers, sometimes I can get it to visibly stretch, but otherwise it's kind of more salt. It's like a booger. Like, yeah. I don't know how else to describe it.
Yeah.
You know, like
it's not seems like watery. It's like more.
Yeah, it's boogerish. A little bit more. Yeah, it has more of its own body. Like, you know, I don't know what to make of that mucus. I think because I want to see it in the book, I want to see an example of it. But you know, so I charted it, but and then on day 31, I saw like a very scant amount of like clear, thin, stretchy mucus, which I was a little bit.
Was it clear or was it cloudy? Because you marked it cloudy.
Oh, I think I meant to put clear there. Whoops.
Okay.
It should have been CK then, right?
Okay. Yeah, and I mean, if you're seeing stretchy mucus in the post-ov, like after you've confirmed ovulation, it can mean a couple different things, but it could mean that your body's maybe not metabolizing your estrogen as effectively as it should be. So there's kind of estrogen floating around that probably shouldn't be there, that your body's having trouble metabolizing. That's one of the reasons that it could be there.
Okay. It was just interesting to me because it fell more in line with of what I would associate as peak quality mucus than what I really saw previously in my cycle. And it showed up at the very end. Yeah. So I found that interesting.
Well, and I think we spoke about this a little bit. So gummy mucus can be associated with inflammation. So in the cervix, you're working with a functional practitioner. And so you're doing like everything.
I'm trying.
You're doing all of the things. But is there anything in particular that you're doing for your cervix? I know we spoke a little bit about that.
No, I ordered a liquid vitamin A and I'm going to try applying that topically. And then I'm scheduling an appointment to a gynecologist just to kind of get checked for any sort of infection. I'm not seeing any yellow mucus or anything that would indicate an infection.
Yeah.
And I haven't had any change in sexual partners since I last got screened for any sort of STIs. So I'm not really sure what's going to come from that, but I did, when last time I looked at my cervix visibly, using a speculum and a mirror, it did look a little bit inflamed to me.
Yeah.
Yeah. So we'll see.
Well, and to add to the mix, folate has been shown to support cervical health, and it's really important for cervical health. So deficiency in folate leads to cervical dysplasia and things like that, which shows in the research. And then women with cervical dysplasia, not that that's what this is, but I'm just giving an example, has been shown to reverse the effects. So something to think about, just because we're seeing the gummy, because gummy,
a lot of gummy.
Yeah, and so I feel like the cervix champion, because I feel like in my groups I'm always like, okay, but what about your cervix? Because I find that
nobody talks about cervical health.
No, they just, as soon as there's something wrong, they are very quick to remove a piece of it. But in terms of keeping the cervix healthy, that would be my suggestion in terms of just in general something. And what I always say is that this isn't something that you're gonna like rub some vitamin A on there and all of a sudden tomorrow
it'll be fixed.
So this is something where you make a note of it on your chart when you start, commit for 3 months, and then reevaluate. So that would make you'd be reevaluating that in
that's an excellent reminder to
February.
mark any supplement changes on your chart. I didn't even think of that.
Yeah. Because for especially when you're new to charting, so I have a totally different perspective because I've seen so many charts, and I've also had the benefit of seeing what can happen over a 15-year period and a 6-month period and a 1-year period. And so for me, when I am fortunate to work with a client over like a 6-month period or even a 12-month period, it's often like when you're in the trenches, you cannot see the forest for the trees. So often like nothing's happening, whatever. And I'll like, well, let's take a look at what was going on 6 months ago. And all of a sudden it's like, wow,
it has changed. Yeah.
That's really important. This is why charting is so helpful, because it's not telling us like, oh my gosh, there's this huge emergency and whatever, but it's telling us it looks like your cervix needs a little bit of support. So let's give your cervix some support. You're doing a lot of other things to support your health in general. And I think that it's helpful to think about those things. And then also it's very helpful in this situation, as you did, to make an appointment and have your physician take a look. And you may just want to ask specifically to say, could you look for cervicotropin or could you look for inflammation? Because it seems as though sometimes it may not go noticed if they're not specifically thinking of it. Yeah, it depends on the practitioner.
You said cervical ectropine. Is that when inner cervix cells or tissue is showing up on the outside?
Yeah, it's essentially that. And it shows up as like an irritation or as kind of like reddish.
Okay.
If you have a strong stomach, you could Google that and click on the images tab.
I could probably handle it.
I don't know. Google is real mean, so.
It can be. I mean, I already saw my own cervix, so I can probably handle it. But yeah, and I do remember when I got the Paragard out that the physician told me like, oh, there's a bit of bleeding. It might've been, adhered a little bit. So I don't know if it's still healing from that. I'm not really sure.
Well, I think that is important to consider because that could definitely be a factor. And so this could be part of the healing process. You're doing things to kind of help it along, but taking out an IUD definitely has the ability to irritate the cervix and cause a little bit of localized inflammation. And then as that heals and get better, you should see a difference. But the gummy is something, it's one of those flags for me that we want to keep looking at. So we want to do some stuff, wait a while, and then aim to see that improve. And if it doesn't improve, you do want to make sure that you're kind of checking back in with your physician about it.
Okay, makes sense.
So yeah, we've covered a lot of ground. We've got a couple of minutes left. Is there anything else that we should jump into today?
I mean, I still have lingering concerns about the overall general lowness of temperatures and the fact that I tend to ovulate really late in my cycle, or late compared to, I guess, a textbook, but that's kind of intense for 5 minutes.
Yeah, that's a pretty lengthy conversation. I think that ultimately we touched on this a little bit in our group session. I'm just trying to remember what was going on with your thyroid, but I think we talked about that a little bit. Just when you're seeing low temperatures, it can be an indication of thyroid or low iron, like I mentioned.
Well, and my iron was low, and so I'm taking iron 3 times a day right now, which not everyone can handle that much iron, but my body seems to be tolerating it, or my digestive system seems to be tolerating it, I should say.
And have you been able to incorporate any iron-rich foods?
Yeah, I haven't been the best at incorporating actual organ meat into my diet yet. It's still kind of on my list, but I have been taking, organ supplement, I guess.
Yeah, like desiccated.
I switched, probably 4 or 5 months ago from being vegetarian. I'm eating meat and red meat, but yeah, I haven't consistently been eating like actual organ meat in my diet.
From what I see, I mean, you're working with a practitioner, you had quite extensive labs done. And so there were a couple things that were identified. So like low B12, low iron, also additional low D. So there was a few things that were identified. And so your practitioner has you kind of on a program. And so it's kind of like what you said before the call, which is that we've identified a bunch of stuff and now we're in the midst of addressing it all.
Waiting. Yeah, waiting.
And I think that to some degree, what's interesting about the chart is that sometimes the chart responds right away, especially if we hit the nail on the hammer. Like if we pick the thing that is causing the most issues, like the spoke in the wheel that's preventing it from running properly, then often you'll see this kind of quick and dramatic shift. But not every woman has that like magical shift. And by
one
shift,
item.
yeah. And by shift, I don't mean like we go from a super problematic chart to perfect, but I mean that there's an obvious shift in the right direction. But I would say that ultimately, if you make these changes and you're working with your practitioner after a couple of months, you know, once you do your follow-up labs and you see where your levels are at and, you know, how where everything's falling out, sorting out, if you're still not seeing an improvement in your chart, then you may want to just look deeper into thyroid function. We talked about iodine deficiency, selenium, different things to support thyroid health. So you may want to just look into that a little bit further if you're not seeing any improvements, because your chart doesn't lie. So if your temperatures are super low, you're ovulating a lot later in the cycle, you're not seeing regular mucus patterns, we know that there's still something up that we need to be looking at.
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense. And I'll be doing new labs in about a month. So in a little bit, I'll see what moved and where we're at.
Yeah, that sounds about right. You know, because by then you will have been following the protocol for 2 to 3 months.
Yeah.
If I remember correctly. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I guess that brings us to the end of our session. Thank you so much, Madi, for having such a very public, private conversation with me.
Absolutely. My pleasure.
And before we go, I'd love for you to share some insight or wisdom or even just some words of encouragement to the women who are listening to the podcast. I know a lot of women find the podcast and like jump in and binge listen to the episode. So it's like yesterday they didn't know about this stuff. And like today they've jumped into this fertility awareness world and, you know, learning how their body works. So what would you want to say to her, especially if she's feeling a little bit overwhelmed?
I think the podcast is a great place to start. I think that's definitely where I got a large majority of the information, and you can look at episode descriptions and, you know, see which episodes make the most sense for you to listen to right now. I also think it's okay to do it in stages. Like I started charting before I even had my Paragard out. And I think there's so many moving parts to charting sometimes, or it can definitely be overwhelming. Just start. Like you don't have to do it perfectly or even halfway correctly, but if you just get into a habit of taking your temperature, like that's a great place to start. And then you can start trying to check for cervical mucus. And then, you know, from there you can play around with different platforms where you're charting. So I think, you know, we always hear like, oh, you know, take it slow, but I think with charting, it especially makes sense. So if you're feeling overwhelmed, just start with your temperatures and go from there. Even if you're still on hormonal contraceptives, like maybe your chart won't make sense, but if you're just trying to build that habit, building that habit is really helpful, especially if you're building it before you really need it. So that would be my suggestion. And then I think any sort of community really is really helpful. And I think there's lots of them out there. There's, you know, Fertility Friday, of course. And then there's also, if you're a Kindara user, they have their online community, which I haven't personally used, but it seems like it's pretty robust. So I think having a support system is important also.
Mm-hmm. I really appreciate that. I'm really glad that you mentioned it. Especially, I love hearing from women who are at that exact stage. So I think it's very practical. And even something occurred to me as you were talking, which is that for you, Madi, your experience has been that, you know, it sounds like you're pretty happy with charting. Mm-hmm. There have been some challenges, meaning that in your, you know, your pre-ovulatory phase is a little bit longer. Throughout the call, we mentioned in one chart, your ovulation happened on day 20, and another chart, your ovulation happened on day 24. And so that puts a lot of your cycle kind of out of the range of being able to use it, especially when we talked about, and what I mean by that specifically is unprotected sex on those days, because many of those days are potentially fertile because of the mucus patterns we're seeing, different things like that. Right. So I feel like for women who are really focused on wanting to use it for birth control, what would you want them to know, especially given that your experience was not just a perfect textbook experience?
For everyone, it's going to be different. I think obviously if you're not sexually active at the moment or don't have a sexual partner, it's probably simpler. At the same time, I felt like it was a really great opportunity to take up space. So throughout my life, I've, you know, been pretty much the sole responsible party for contraceptives. And, you know, fortunately, I do have a supportive partner, but it was, you know, it was still hard to kind of say, no, we're going to share this responsibility now. And, It's hard because everyone has their own feelings about, for example, barrier methods. Not everyone's a big fan. But for me, it was like, well, I've done significant things to my body to prevent pregnancy throughout my life and in this relationship. And, I don't have to be the only one doing those things anymore. So yeah, I felt like it was a call to take up some space and do what was best for me, which I feel, although hormonal contraceptives are a great resource for a lot of people, and I would never want to take that away from anyone, it's also puts all of the responsibility on the female and her body. So that's what I would say, is just take up a space for yourself and do what you need to do and honor that journey. Just know that it won't be difficult forever. I'm still in the thick of it with my cycle, but it's definitely improved over the last 6 months. So it gets better all the time.
I love that. And I can say that if you didn't have your cycle, if you weren't looking at it all the time, a lot of the conversations that we are having wouldn't be taking place.
Yeah, I wouldn't have known I was low in B12 or vitamin D. I just wouldn't have occurred to me to look for it.
Well, and a last question for you, for any of the listeners who are, they've been thinking about doing the program, or maybe this is the very first episode they're listening to and they're like, what the heck is this 10-week fertility awareness mastery program? What would you want a woman to know if she's thinking about doing it?
There's a lot of literature out there, and, it's wonderful that there's so much science, and it can be incredibly overwhelming that there's so much science. I am several years away from any sort of academic science course or human anatomy course, and wading through some of the books has not been easy, or kind of getting a firm grasp on the rules. It's really great to have a safe space to ask questions, especially questions as nitty gritty as like, should I part my labia when I wipe? Like, where are you going to ask that question? So I think it's really great to have a safe space to do that. So I would recommend that anybody trying to embark on fertility awareness for the first time try and find some sort of resource or support system. But I think the beauty of the 10-week program is that you get to see other women's charts and you get to talk about them or hear about their health journeys. So it's more than just seeing someone else's chart. It's understanding everything that's going on behind it. And every person has a different aspect of their journey that's affecting their chart. So things might come up that someone else has mastered and you haven't, or vice versa. It's always fun to support other people or contribute to their journey too.
Oh, well, thank you so much, Madi. And of course, thank you for being here. It was such a blast having you on the show and also having this extra time with you, because of course I love our one-on-ones. I mean, I love our group sessions too, but I always love the one-on-ones because it gives us an opportunity to connect personally.
Oh, yay. It was a lot of fun. I love getting the extra time in.
Well, thanks again.
All right.
Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed today's show, please share it with a friend. You'll find the show notes page for today's episode at fertilityfriday.com/171. I hope that you enjoyed my interview with Madi. It was so nice to be able to chat with her. I really enjoyed our conversation today, and there's just so many great takeaways. I was saying to her in our post chat that I really love the way that she talked about her choice of switching to fertility awareness as a form of birth control. And, she described it as her decision to take up more space in the relationship, and really talking about how she kind of owned and acknowledged that for the majority of her relationship and also the majority of her life, she had just taken, full responsibility for the birth control aspect of it. Not that there's anything wrong with that, but to really just say, like, now it's time for me to not do anything to my body and for us to manage our fertility differently. And so, as Madi and I were talking about that, one of the things that came up that I wanted to share with you is just that idea of that transition period. So, when I was thinking about it, I think about my own experience, and as someone who had the incredible good fortune of discovering fertility awareness when I was either 18 or 19 and never being in a relationship with somebody and using any type of hormonal contraceptive, I have never had to renegotiate that territory. I have only ever had to negotiate it once. And so at the beginning of any relationship that I was in, I would negotiate because I wasn't on the hormones. So there was clearly some sort of negotiation that had to be made because for the vast majority of my reproductive life, I have actively been avoiding pregnancy. I have 2 children, and those 2 children happened at very specific periods of time. And so the rest of the time I was actively avoiding pregnancy. And so, every time I found myself in a relationship, I would have to negotiate that. And however, I didn't ever have to renegotiate it. So I feel like that's a particular challenge for a lot of women, where you're in a relationship with someone, you've been in that relationship for a while, or even if you're starting a new relationship, but you've never had to negotiate, hormone-free sexual activity, if you will. That is something completely different. So that adds another variable, another factor. Not everyone is comfortable with using barrier methods. Not everybody likes them. Not everyone loves the idea of having to make a decision before every time you have sex. So, the whole idea that if you have to do something before you have sex, it's going to take away the spontaneity or the romance or something like that. It's a different way of interacting, that's for sure. And so I think that's, I just wanted to highlight that challenge, especially for women who are in that transitioning phase, because when you first entered into your relationship, whether you did it, quote unquote, formally or not, had a negotiation about how you were going to organize your sexual activity. And then somewhere in the middle, now you're having to renegotiate the terms and figuring out how to adjust now that you're transitioning from a different method of birth control, whether that's a hormonal or, in Madi's case, the copper IUD. So I just wanted to highlight that because I thought that the way that she talked about that was really interesting, and the way that she put it. And I also felt like that would hit a lot of women hard, just the thought of actually being okay with standing up and saying, I think things need to switch it up. I feel like I've been taking on this responsibility for a long time, and now I think it's time for us to share it. So great thoughts to end on. So thank you again, Madi, for being on the show. I really appreciate every woman who's been part of my Fertility Awareness Reality Series. This is part of my vision, to bring these topics into the light, to make them more accessible for women. There's no more boundaries and barriers to knowledge. It's just out there. And also the importance of incorporating real women's stories. You all know that I love doing interviews with experts because I am a nerd, and I love talking to people about these topics who have specialized in their field, who have written books about these topics, and who have been in practice for, 10, 15, 20 years and are able to share their clinical experience with us. But just as much as I love that, I also love speaking and connecting with real women and talking about their experiences in the trenches, what their experiences have been like around their birth control methods, what their experiences have been like transitioning to fertility awareness. And that, I find, in my perspective and also from the feedback that I've had from you, is just invaluable, because as Madi said, where else can you go to have these conversations and to be able to gain this knowledge? So really thankful for all of the women who've been part of the Fertility Awareness Reality Series. And I love how open and vulnerable each of these women have been, willing to share their stories, and also, of course, with the hope that it's going to touch women's lives, which it does. So thank you so much for listening to the show today. Super happy to be here with you. And so if you want to join us in the next round of my 10-week Fertility Awareness Mastery group program, be sure to head over to fertilityfriday.com/group program and apply so that we can reserve your spot today. And I just want to thank you all for hanging out with me today and for supporting the community, for listening to the episode, for taking me along with you, whatever you're doing today. So whether you're walking the dog, commuting to work, I know some of you take me while you work out if you're at the gym, or if you're doing dishes. I often listen to podcasts when I'm doing dishes or laundry or other types of housework. And so whatever you're doing today, I really appreciate you letting me be part of your day. I really appreciate all of you for supporting the show. I love that you all share the show. I also really appreciate all of you who've reviewed the show. I do look at all the reviews, and there's so many. So I really appreciate all of you for taking the time to support the show, however you've seen fit to do that. So thanks again, and as always, be well and happy charting.